I come confessing that I am a great lover of old black and white movies. On several evenings, you will find me parked in front of my television set watching AMC, TNT, TCM, the classic movie channel. And it's because my background in history and communication makes me extremely fond, especially of old films, 1930s, 1940s. And so you then can understand how I would go back and pick up one of these old movies as the inspiration for my sermon today. And assuming that media ministry is ready, I want to talk to you from a sermon title and topic, Citizen Christian. Citizen Christian. Now, those of you who are familiar with old black and white movies, you've already made the connection and know that my sermon's title today is a play on the film Citizen Kane. And if we go to the next slide, one of the things that I want to show you is that in 1941, the leading movie to be released that secured multiple Academy Awards was Citizen Kane, starring Orson Welles. I can hear him whispering, Rosebud. One of the things that I marvel over in the making of that movie is that it included several upstart actors and actresses that were little known at that time, but who in later years went on to become household names. Let me give you an example. The mother of the young Citizen Kane was played by this upstart actress by the name of Agnes Moorehead. In 1941, Agnes Moorehead was little known. About 25 years later, however, Agnes Moorehead, who is pictured to the right here on the screen, played the role of Endora, who was the mother of Samantha in the television series Bewitched. I'm also a great fan of the twitching nose of Samantha in Bewitched. But we first learned of Endora, or Agnes Moorehead, in the 1941 film of Citizen Kane. In like fashion, those of you who can go back to the black and white versions of Perry Mason knows that the antagonist of Perry Mason was always the police inspector. His name was Ray Collins. And before Ray Collins ever appeared on Perry Mason, he first appeared in Citizen Kane. He was the rival politician to Citizen Kane that literally unraveled his political career. The point being that several of the actors and actresses that would later go on to claim fame got their start in the movie Citizen Kane. Well, if we go back to the movie, the narrative of the movie is very, very interesting. Let's go to the next slide. The movie is loosely based on the life of William Randolph Hearst, who at the time was the leading newspaper tycoon of the 20th century. Now, some of you are old enough to remember the name of Patty Hearst. Patty Hearst was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, and the movie Citizen Kane was an attempt to capture the life of William Randolph Hearst. Now, watch this, watch this. The plot of the story is about a man who has immense wealth and money, but ends up dying alone and miserable. The feature of this film is that Citizen Kane starts in the Midwest. He purchases this off-brand newspaper in New York. He builds a media empire. He amasses great wealth. He even runs for public office. But in the end, he dies alone. He dies a miserable man who, despite his wealth and money, could not find happiness. And when I think about the plot in the movie of Citizen Kane, it reminds me of a conversation. Let's go to the next slide. It reminds me of a conversation that Jesus has with his disciples. The moral of the story brings us to a conversation that Jesus had with his disciples about the dangers, watch this, of placing wealth over your relationship with God. Beloved, I don't care how much money you have, it doesn't guarantee a right relationship with God. And so Jesus, in his conversation, go on to the next slide, Jesus in his conversation discusses here in the book of Mark chapter 8 verse 36, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose their soul? The King James Version puts it like this: for what doth it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose their soul? It is interesting to me that the writer of Mark admonishes us to keep our eye on Jesus. This text comes to us from the book of Mark, and of the 66 books of the Bible, the book of Mark is the 41st book thereof, consisting of 16 chapters, 678 verses, 11,304 words. It is sequentially the second of the four Gospels that appear in the New Testament, but chronologically, it is the first of the Gospels to have been written, having been written in 62 A.D., the earliest of the canonized books of the New Testament written as a gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, when we look at the book of Mark, Mark has several items going on in this particular chapter. Number one, there is the story of Jesus feeding 4,000 with 7 loaves of bread and just a few fish. That's the story where there are 7 baskets left over after Jesus feeds the 4,000. But the disciples are in such a rush to get to the other side of the sea until they forget the baskets on the beach. And by the time they get on the water and out of reach of the baskets, they begin to have this argument about whose fault it is that the food has been left behind. And Jesus eventually has to intervene and referee by reminding the disciples, why are you fussing and fighting over food? Didn't you just see me feed 4,000 with 7 loaves and a few fish? Don't you think if I could take care of 4,000, I certainly can take care of 12 in a boat? Can I talk up in here? And Jesus goes on to say, why can't you understand who it is you have in your midst? That's the feeding of the 4,000. And then, of course, when they get on the other side of the sea, they are met by a blind man from the town of Bethsaida. And Jesus takes this man from the town of Bethsaida, heals him of his blindness, and then tells him not to go back to Bethsaida, which means the house that is cursed, but to go home. And when he gets home, to show himself to the people who remember him for having been blind. And you don't have to say a word. Just let them see you. And they will see what God has done in your life. I'm trying to tell somebody up in here, You don't have to convince folk. You don't have to brag and boast. All you have to do is let folk see where you are now. And when they think about what you used to be, how you used to act, how you used to talk, and they see how God has blessed you, you become a living testimony. Oh, come on here, somebody. And then, of course, concluding the book of Mark, there is this conversation at the foot of Mount Hermon that Jesus has with his disciples, where he raises this rhetorical question about whom do men say that I am? And the responses are varied. Some say that you're Elijah, Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets. But it is Peter who provides the correct confessional. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And of course, Jesus responds by saying, flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven. And then, of course, the chapter 8 of the book of Mark closes with Jesus predicting his own calamity and death. All of these are items that appear in Mark 8. But what I want to draw your attention to is Jesus attempting to make disciples out of those who are following him. Take a look at the next slide. The next slide discusses Jesus' explanation as to what it means to be his disciple. Now let me share this with you. Beloved, there is a difference between being called a disciple and being a disciple. There's a difference between what folk call you and what you is. Can I talk up in here? And Jesus is trying to establish with those who are following him, don't settle for just being called my disciple, but rather be my disciple. Beloved, you don't want folk just to say that you go to church. You want to live your life in such a way that when they see you, they see the church. Can I talk up in here? Because it just may be that the best sermon they will ever hear or see won't be what they get from Bishop Luda. You very well may turn out to be the best sermon available to some folk out there. And so Jesus takes time to explain, what does it mean to be a disciple? And one of the things, beloved, that it means to be a disciple is to have correct priorities. In other words, Jesus wants them to know nothing wrong with having stuff. But don't let your stuff replace your God. Watch this, watch this. Because the reality is, whatever stuff you have is a result of what the Lord has given you. And if you make stuff more important than God, then the God who gave you the stuff may have to take the stuff in order to remind you that he, God, is more important than the stuff that he's given you. Am I helping anybody with this? And so Jesus argues here, I want you to be in possession of right priorities. I want you to understand that while materialism may make life comfortable, it's not a replacement for your relationship with God. Can I talk up in here? Let's go to the next slide. Now, in Jesus' effort to explain the importance of right relationship over goods, over wealth, over money, 2 chapters later, chapter 10 of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has an encounter and a conversation with a rich man, wherein he tells the citizen Cain of his day how worthless his being rich is when it comes to God. And he uses some imagery here that most of you have heard of before. Jesus actually reaches back into the archives of Talmudic literature to make his point to this young rich man. The Talmudic literature says that it's harder for a man to enter paradise than it is for an elephant to get through the eye of a needle. And in the case of Jesus, he substitutes elephant for a camel. So that Jesus says it's hard for a camel to get through the eye of a needle. Can I talk up in here? Now, in this illustration, and let's go back to the slide, my staff used the needle that is associated with sowing. It is easier for a rich man to get through the eye of a needle. Jesus borrows from the Babylonian Talmud, which talks about an elephant going through the eye of a needle. In Jesus' case, he substitutes a camel for an elephant. Why? Because the people, watch this, that Jesus is talking to are more familiar with camels than they are elephants. Camels are an Asiatic animal. Elephants were not natural to that part of the world. So if he had used an elephant, a lot of people listening to Jesus would have cocked their head to the right because they wouldn't have really known what he was talking about because they were not familiar with elephants. But everyone he's talking to knows what a camel is. Now, the picture on the screen denotes a needle that's used in sewing. But that's not what Jesus was talking about. Jesus was using the eye of a needle as a metaphor. But the eye of a needle that he's talking about is not what you would think of when you think of a needle. Now, the point here is that to get through the eye of a needle, one had to unload all of their material assets so that the camel would have to get on their knees. Jesus is highlighting that our relationship with God is obtained by humility and not what we own. Now, let me explain this to you. Jesus is not talking about a sewing needle. He's talking about one of the 12 entrances to the city of Jerusalem. And this particular entrance is where two large boulders come together, leaving a small gap into the city of Jerusalem. The gap is so small until one has to make an adjustment in order to get through the gap if they want to get into the city. Now, for Jesus here, the city represents heaven. And the person trying to get through the gap is you. But the camel represents your stuff. Come on, work with me here, work with me here. Now, the opening to heaven is so small until one has to literally thread their way through the passage into the city. And because it is so small and so difficult, the people of that day called that gap the eye of a needle. And so the point here is that it's not impossible, but it is difficult. All right, can I explain this? Can I explain this? Watch this, beloved. Remember, the people of Jesus' day were nomadic people, meaning that they moved around a whole lot. They were, in a modern sense, they were somewhat homeless because they moved around so much. And because they moved around so much, they had to keep their stuff with them. All right, you're looking at me like you have no idea what I'm talking about. All right, come on, let me take you to New York City. Anybody ever seen any homeless folk in New York City? Well, one of the features of a homeless person is because they're homeless and they have no permanent place to lay their head or storage, whatever they have it gathered in a shopping cart or something that they can move along with them. So you've seen people with these large green bags that have bottles and clothes, and because the whole idea is wherever I go, I got to take my stuff with me. Because if I leave it, it may not be there when I get back. So the practice is to keep your stuff with you. Well, it's kind of like that in Jesus' day. What Jesus is saying is that whatever a wealthy man had, he kept it with him. And when he or she would travel, they would load up the back of their camel with all of their stuff so that they could keep an eye on their wealth. Now, the problem is that when those persons came to Jerusalem to get into the city, their camel could not pass through the eye of a needle, standing up with all that stuff on their back. So the only way that a camel could get through the eye of a needle, the owner of the stuff had to take the stuff off the back of the camel and push the stuff through the gap. And then the camel, Lord have mercy, had to get down on his knees and inch and crawl his way through the eye of a needle in order to get through. Are y'all hearing me? And what Jesus, in this citizen Christian, is explaining to his disciples is that if you want to get into heaven, there's no problem with having stuff. But do understand, your stuff ain't more important than where you're trying to get to. And that if you, come on here somebody, that if you want to get into heaven, you're going to have to set aside your stuff. You're going to have to take it down from its high and lofty place and put your materialism on the ground. Then you're going to have to get on your knees, which is the posture of humility. And I'm trying to tell somebody that when you're trying to get God's attention, you can't impress him with your stuff. You got to get on your knees and say, Father, I stretch my hands to thee. Yeah! You got to set it aside. Woo! You have to assume the position and the posture of humility. Hello, somebody. Because in the end, you can't take it with you. I don't care what you've accumulated. I don't care how fat your bank book might be. Last slide. I'm going back to my seat. Beloved, I need you to understand that materialism and wealth is not necessarily what's most important. Can I talk up in here? Listen, you can have a house, but it may not be a home. Can I talk up in here? You might own a car, but can you appreciate going for a ride? You may have money, but the question is, are you happy? You may own clothes, but are you covered and in your right mind? Yeah! Yeah! You may even hang out with a crowd, but do you have any real friends? I think I need to say that again. I ain't talking about people who are taking up space in your life, but they have anybody that you can lean on, depend on. Yeah! Come on, take me to my next slide. I'm trying to sit down. I'm trying to let it go. Oh, glory. Woo! Hallelujah. When the Bible talks about losing your soul, the Bible is discussing the forfeiture of your relationship with God. It is a reference to not having the kind of relationship that you ought to have. So when the Bible says, what doth it profit a man to gain the whole world, but lose your relationship with God? Listen, you can impress me, but that's not what's important. What's important, are you in covenant with God? You can have the fine house, the big car, the bling bling, and still miss God. Hello, somebody. Let me put it the way God puts it. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and all of his righteousness, and all the other bling bling and other things that you're looking for comes after having a proper relationship with God. I close with this. I do believe this is the last slide. Beloved, in the Silicon Valley, there's a man who had made millions. He was immensely wealthy. But the tragedy is he worked so hard for his wealth until it cost him his life. He literally worked himself to death. And at his funeral, hundreds, even thousands of people came to pay their last respect to this gentleman who had accumulated so much wealth. And somebody in the crowd raised a rhetorical question. They asked, how much money did he leave behind? And here's the answer. All of it. Oh, turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor, you can't take it with you. Come on, turn to somebody else and say, neighbor, you can't take it with you. I was glad when they said unto me, let us, yes, I will confess to you, I like nice things. I'm partial to 5-star restaurants. I appreciate quality in clothes and apparel. But I won't get it twisted. I understand that if it had not been for the Lord, yeah. Come on, rest on your feet, rest on your feet. I'm looking today for some citizen Christians, not Citizen Kane's whispering rosebud, but citizen Christians who understands that it doth not profit myself to gain the whole world, but lose my relationship with God.